The state of South Carolina carried out its latest execution on June 13, 2025. Stephen Christopher Stanko, 57 years old, met his end by lethal injection after nearly 2 decades on death row. Today, we're diving deep into his final hours, his last meal, his final words, and the brutal crimes that sealed his fate. Stephen Stanko had mastered the art of deception. To anyone watching, he appeared to be a man genuinely trying to turn his life around. Articulate, seemingly remorseful, an ex-convict who had written a book during his previous incarceration and claimed to have learned from his mistakes. But beneath that carefully crafted exterior lurked something far more sinister. In 1996, Stanko had been sentenced to a decade behind bars for assault and kidnapping. He served nearly 9 years before walking free in 2004. Upon his release, he made his way to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, where he found a modest room to rent. He wasn't flashy or attention-seeking. He paid his rent, albeit sometimes late, and generally kept a low profile. His landlady had been warned by his parole officer about his criminal past, but Stanko had already been upfront about it. Transparency, it seemed, was part of his new approach to life. Or so it appeared. Initially, Stanko seemed committed to rehabilitation. He spoke of wanting to move forward, though he complained that securing employment with a felony conviction proved challenging. He cycled through a few brief jobs before suddenly departing town, claiming he needed to assist in caring for an elderly friend's mother. But this explanation was far from the truth. About a year after his release, Stanko became a regular fixture at the local public library. He told anyone who asked that he was researching and writing a book about serial killers. He presented this as part of his rehabilitation process, a way to understand criminal behavior and transform his own life. But those long hours among the books were leading him down a much darker path. At the library, he developed a relationship with Laura Ling, a 43-year-old librarian. She was compassionate and trusting, qualities that drew Stanko to her. Eventually, their relationship progressed to the point where he moved into her home, where she lived with her 15-year-old daughter. Around this same period, Stanko began casual conversations with Henry Turner, a 74-year-old man who frequented the library. Their interactions were nothing more than friendly small talk between two regular patrons. Henry had no way of knowing the true nature of the man he was chatting with, or what horrors he was capable of unleashing. That ignorance wouldn't last long. Everything changed on April 7, 2005. Inside Laura's home that evening, something snapped in Stanko. He would later claim that he and Laura had gotten into an argument, that she had struck him, and that a lit cigarette he was holding became trapped between his glasses and his face. According to his account, everything went dark after that moment. He bound Laura's hands behind her back and began beating her mercilessly. Then he made his way down the hallway toward her daughter's bedroom. "Make a sound and I'll kill you both," he warned the terrified girl. She desperately tried to reach her mother, but when she entered the bedroom, Laura was already on the floor, barely conscious and moaning in pain. Before the daughter could react, Stanko struck her in the head, and she lost consciousness. When she regained awareness, Stanko was on top of her. She fought with everything she had, kicking, clawing, and struggling, but he overpowered her. After the assault, he dragged her into the bedroom where Laura was still clinging to life. The daughter was convinced she was about to die in that room. Then she watched in horror as Stanko wrapped his hands around her mother's throat. In that moment, a thought crystallized in her mind. Don't let this happen. Be the daughter who died trying to save her mother. Stanko strangled Laura, turned her body face down, and finished the job. He then turned his attention back to the daughter, retrieved a knife, and slashed her throat twice. Believing he had killed them both, he calmly walked to the bathroom to shower. According to his later testimony, it was during this shower that his memory fully returned. He checked both victims for pulses and found none. But instead of calling for emergency help or turning himself in, he packed his belongings, stepped over the daughter's bleeding body, and left the house. But the daughter wasn't dead. Severely injured and losing blood, she managed to crawl to a phone and dial 911. 911. What's your emergency? Help me. I'm sorry, can you speak up? Someone broke into my house and... Okay, where are you located? My mom is dead. I'm sorry. My mom is dead. Emergency responders arrived as quickly as possible, but it was too late for Laura. And Stanko was long gone. He had stolen Laura's credit cards and jewelry before driving to Conway, directly to Henry Turner's home. He told Henry that his father had just passed away and asked if he could stay for a few days. Henry, being the kind-hearted man he was, didn't question the request. He welcomed Stanko into his home. That night, Stanko slept peacefully under Henry's roof. The following morning, April 8th, the two men shared breakfast together: eggs, toast, and coffee. Henry had no idea he was sitting across from someone who had committed murder just hours earlier. Later that morning, as Henry stood at the bathroom mirror shaving, completely vulnerable and unaware, Stanko quietly entered the room. He raised a handgun, pressed a pillow against it to suppress the noise, and fired. Henry collapsed to the floor, wounded but still alive. Without hesitation, Stanko struck him in the head and then fired another shot into his chest. A peaceful morning routine had become a cold-blooded execution. Stanko emptied Henry's bank accounts, stole his pickup truck, and fled once again. By that evening, he had reached Columbia, South Carolina, where he used Henry's money to buy drinks for strangers in local bars. He was charming, sociable, and blended in perfectly, as if he hadn't just murdered two innocent people in 24 hours. From Columbia, he continued to Augusta, Georgia. But what Stanko didn't realize was that his actions had triggered a massive law enforcement response. His name and photograph were being circulated nationwide, and a $10,000 reward had been posted for information leading to his capture. Time was running out. In Augusta, Stanko presented himself as a successful businessman who owned multiple Hooters restaurant franchises. He claimed to be in town for the Masters golf tournament. His demeanor was confident and polished, exactly what you'd expect from a wealthy entrepreneur. This persona allowed him to meet a local woman who had no reason to doubt his story. He charmed her with conversation and stories, and she invited him to her home. She believed everything he told her because he was so convincing. Stanko spent several days living in her house, but on April 12th, just after midnight, he disappeared without explanation. The next morning, the woman opened her newspaper and felt her blood run cold. There, on the front page, was Stephen Stanko's photograph, with headlines about a double murder manhunt. She immediately contacted the police. Within hours, U.S. Marshals had surrounded the area. Before Stanko could escape Augusta, he was in handcuffs. The man who had once written a book from prison was heading back behind bars, this time permanently. When investigators searched his residence, they discovered something that disturbed even veteran law enforcement officers: extensive collections of newspaper clippings and articles about Jeffrey Dahmer, Gary Ridgway, and other notorious serial killers. One detective summarized it bluntly. He was either just fascinated by serial killers, or he was on his way to becoming one. But what drove Steven Stanko to commit such heinous acts? Stanko entered the world on a U.S. military base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. From the outside, it appeared that discipline and order were fundamental parts of his upbringing. However, problems emerged early in his life. In 1983, when Stanko was just 15 years old, his younger brother Billy perished in a house fire. The official cause was never determined, and the case remains unsolved to this day. However, rumors of arson surrounded the incident. This tragedy fundamentally changed the family dynamic. Stanko's father, who had been strict but involved, became distant and consumed by grief and anger. Eventually, he completely severed his relationship with Steven. Despite these challenges, Stanko showed academic potential. At age 17, he scored in the 85th percentile on the SAT with a 500 in verbal and 620 in mathematics. He harbored dreams of attending the Air Force Academy. But in 1986, when his application was rejected, something inside him shattered. He attempted community college and explored various career paths, but nothing seemed to stick. Soon, the aimless drifting evolved into petty theft, which opened the door to much more serious criminal behavior. In 1992, 24-year-old Stanko began a relationship with a woman named Liz. Initially, he appeared charming, perhaps a bit eccentric, but nothing that seemed particularly concerning. However, the lies began accumulating. Fake business schemes, theft from neighbors, and suspicious behavior that never quite added up. The more Liz questioned him, the more evasive he became. Then came the night she woke up to find him standing silently beside her bed, just watching her. Before she could scream, he attempted to smother her. She pleaded with him to stop, promising she would never mention the incident if he would leave her alone. Surprisingly, he agreed, but the peace didn't last. On February 20th, 1996, everything came to a head. Stanko and Liz engaged in a violent physical altercation. Afterward, she went to bed, exhausted and traumatized. But hours later, she was awakened by the overwhelming smell of bleach. Stanko was standing over her with a bleach-soaked cloth and attacked her without warning. Police soon arrived to find Liz bound and restrained. Stanko was arrested and charged with kidnapping. In April 1996, a grand jury handed down a comprehensive indictment: kidnapping, assault and battery with intent to kill, 9 counts of breach of trust with fraudulent intent, and 2 counts of obtaining property under false pretenses. He had secured employment at an automobile dealership, then proceeded to steal both new and used vehicles, selling them to Liz's neighbor. When everything was tallied up, Stanko was facing 10 years in prison. It could have ended there. For Stanko, however, it was just the beginning. In 2006, Stanko faced trial for Laura Ling's murder. He entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, but the jury rejected this defense. They found him guilty and imposed the death penalty. Additionally, he received 110 years for the kidnapping and sexual assault of Laura's daughter. In 2009, he stood trial again, this time for Henry Turner's murder. Once again, the jury returned a guilty verdict and sentenced him to death. For years, Stanko's legal team fought to overturn these convictions. They filed numerous appeals, arguing that he suffered from mental impairments and that the courts had failed to adequately consider his age and cognitive limitations during sentencing. But every appeal was unsuccessful, both at the state and federal levels. Stanko would spend the next 2 decades on death row. On May 5, 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final petition for review. Just 11 days later, the state scheduled his execution for June 13, 2025. Stanko had until May 30th to select his method of execution: electric chair, firing squad, or lethal injection. Initially, he was leaning toward the firing squad, describing it as appearing quick and clean. However, after learning about what happened to Michael Mahdi, Stanko began reconsidering his choice. Mahdi had been the second person executed by firing squad in South Carolina in 2025. Theoretically, the process was straightforward: 3 bullets, no blanks, aimed directly at the heart. But when his legal team obtained the autopsy report, it revealed a disturbing reality. Only 1 bullet had actually penetrated a heart chamber, while the others missed critical areas, meaning death was not instantaneous. His attorneys argued that he likely suffered for 3 to 4 times longer than anticipated, and witnesses reported hearing him groan 45 seconds after the shots were fired. There were additional concerning details. Only 1 photograph was taken during Mahdi's autopsy, showing 2 chest wounds. Officials maintained that 3 bullets had been fired, claiming that 2 had entered through the same opening, but there were no X-rays, no analysis of clothing, and no ballistic trajectory studies. Nothing that would allow independent experts to verify these claims. This information completely changed Stanko's perspective, and within days he opted for lethal injection instead. On Friday, June 13, 2025, Stephen Stanko's time ran out. That evening, he was secured to the gurney with one arm extended, where medical personnel inserted an IV line to deliver the lethal drugs. Outside the prison, demonstrators had gathered, carrying signs reading, "Who would Jesus execute?" and "An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind." Inside the execution chamber, the atmosphere was sterile and quiet. The execution process began after Stanko's lawyers read his final statement, which lasted 3.5 minutes. In his statement, Stanko expressed remorse to his victims and asked not to be defined by his worst actions. "I am deeply sorry for the pain and suffering I have caused through this terrible situation. Sorry will never be sufficient, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be expressed." When the signal was given, prison officials administered the first dose of the sedative pentobarbital. Stanko moved his lips, appearing to mouth words, and turned toward the victim's family members. He then took several rapid breaths as his lips trembled. He appeared to stop breathing after about 1 minute. A prison staff member requested a second dose of pentobarbital approximately 13 minutes later. Stanko was officially pronounced dead at 6:34 p.m. Details regarding his final meal have not yet been made public. We'll update you in the comments section as more information becomes available. Stephen Christopher Stanko was 57 years old at the time of his execution.